Violent video games is not the root of all evil. The economy is suffering real bad right now. That extends to our video game industry as well. Often thought of as the bane of our universe by most parents and video game market as a whole is suffering because of this big benefactor, the fight against video game violence. The problem is that video game violence is which is the same as violence in movies and violence in books, is misunderstood and considered something different. And people believe that video game violence causes others to be violent. It's the fact that people cannot detach fake from reality that causes people to be violent, but people want to blame something and choose video games instead of other media because they don't understand video games. In this suffering economy, we need to mature out of this and break those stereotypes about video games and fix the misunderstanding. Two largest media releases in the last decade were video games that consisted of violence. Of those millions of customers, not one was convicted of a felony that they proved due to those video games. Let us go over some of the research for these video game violence. There are many misconceptions in video games that need to be gone over to understand my argument. One of the biggest issues and misconceptions in competitiveness with aggressiveness. In one study from Purdue University, Brad Sheets and William Gaziano mentioned other researchers relating to aggressiveness caused from video games, but then in their own article refer to the same aggressiveness as competitiveness. This is the same competitiveness that we encourage in our athletes and even in our schools, where students are expected to try and outperform each other throughout their education. It is common for most violent video games to be competitive because they usually offer some kind of multiplayer component that pits people against each other. It is no different than sports like football, whose players are also considered extremely competitive, even in non-competitive situations. Another misconception about video games is that they have no benefit to people who play them. In research done by Christopher Ferguson, he researches the positive developments of playing violent video games. He also points out that violence often replaces a common theme in video games, which is action. It is in this action that he concluded that people improve their visuospatial cognition. In his research, he found that 24% of violent video game players show improvement in their visuospatial cognition compared to the 2% correlation between violence and people being violent when playing violent video games. Most of these misconceptions have to do with video games as a whole being misunderstood. When people are substituting words like competitive with aggressive and action with violent, it's easy to see why misunderstanding exists. The media also contributes, as Ferguson points out, that Columbine and Virginia Tech shootings have been associated with video games by the media, but without substantial evidence. These points show how misunderstood video games are. Now we can look at what researchers have found that relate aggressiveness with video games. The relationship found between aggressiveness and video game violence is not really there. As I stated earlier, Christopher Ferguson found through others' research that there was 2% correlation between violent video games and aggression. He also found that biased opinion against video games caused more than half of all researches done in video games to be around violent video games and violence related to it. With this kind of bias, it would be impossible for anyone to get an even-minded argument about video games. In a research done by William Cronenberg and others from Indiana University School of Medicine, they found that adolescents with prior history of disruptive behavior were more inclined to watch more violent and play more violent video games than adolescents who had no history of disruptive behavior. The point here is that other factors contribute to aggressive behavior of people and people that have a history of disruptive behavior play more violent video games and therefore contribute to the association of violence with violent video games. Sheets and Graziano from Purdue University also found that subjects who played violent video games were more competitive than those who played non-violent video games. While this did show some difference between those who played violent video games and non-violent video games, it only showed that those who played violent video games were more cautious and less trusting, which is something we teach our young children to keep them safe. This shows that there is very little correlation between aggressiveness and violent video games. Let us recap and conclude this speech. Video games are misunderstood, and violence and violent video games have very little to do with each other. We have gone over the misunderstandings of video games. One such misunderstanding is terms such as competitive being replaced with aggressiveness and action being replaced with violence. Another point was that aggressiveness and violent video games do not go hand in hand. With only 2% of correlation and the fact that people with destructive behaviors are often more inclined to play violent video games and therefore show very little likeliness between them. In conclusion, we can see that playing violent video games, being aggressive, are not related, and that we need to educate people on misunderstood video games so that they don't bandwagon bash just because the media and other biased parties do.